Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV, Whiskey 1 Good Vibrations. A little more reminiscing about my early ham radio years. My second ham radio transceiver it actually was, after I decided that the Hallicrafters SX-130 and the Viking Adventurer E.F. Johnson transmitter were not enough. You know, you gotta upgrade, right? So my dad took me back up to Electronics Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I saw a radio that caught my eye, mainly just because it was so handsome. And it looked like it had such a neat frequency readout on it. It was called the National 200. And it had 200 watts plate power input, a considerable upgrade from the 50 watts that I'd had before with the Viking Adventurer transmitter. And it had a built-in VFO. I don't believe it had a calibrator. I think you had to rely on something like CHU Canada or just don't transmit where you don't hear anybody else transmitting. I don't believe it had a calibrator, but you could purchase one as an option. In any case, I got on the air with that thing and I made contacts with it. It was one of those radios. If you'll read the article on page 64 of the May 2017 issue of QST magazine, it describes how the part of the myth and part of the reality of the upper sideband, lower sideband conundrum as for mixing, how sometimes you get LSB and sometimes you get USB, and why you get what when, and why you don't get what when. Anyhow, this was one of those radios where some of the bands tuned backwards. You tuned the VFO to increase the frequency on some bands, and it would cause the frequency to decrease on other bands. So I don't recall which bands exactly were which, but I believe the National 200 is mentioned in that article on page 64 of the May 2017 issue of QST as one of those radios that had that mixing scheme, that had a couple of different intermediate frequencies or something like that. Anyway, I operated quite a couple of years maybe with that radio. People started telling me that my CW signal had a chirp. Now this was an SSB transceiver, designed for single sideband, not for CW. And so it only had a sideband filter, 2.7 kilohertz wide, I believe. But people started telling me I had a chirp, and I couldn't hear my own signal on that radio, so I listened finally to it on another radio. And sure enough, it had a kind of a slow chirp. Well, like like that. Or if you listen on the other sideband, you know, that kind of a thing. And even in 1968, 1969, thereabouts, a chirp was kind of indicative of an inferior radio. There's something wrong with it. So I sent it in for repair to their factory and got it back a few weeks later, quite a long while as I remember, and the bloody thing still had a chirp on it. Eventually that caused me to give up on that radio and trade it in for my third and probably most favorite of all time ham radios, the Drake R4A and T4X. which I will perhaps describe in another video. I remember down at the courthouse in Rochester, Minnesota, Olmsted County, W0 Mike X-Ray Whiskey had the Drake R4 and T4X, R4 receiver, T4X transmitter, and an L4 or L4A, something like that, linear amplifier, and Ned Carman, W0ZSW, one of my mentors at that time, and a well-known, the founder of the Handyham system, which eventually ended up in Golden Valley, Minnesota. I remember him actually proposing the idea at a Rochester Amateur Radio Club meeting one day. I remember Ned very well. A really cool guy. Well, whenever the radios misbehaved, he'd always say, "Son of a gun! Son of a gun!" And he called the Drake radios the birds. I guess Drake's, ducks, so birds. He called them the birds. Not the BYRDS, which happened to be one of my favorite rock bands at the time, but the birds, the radios. But in regards to the National 200, it was a nice little radio, but I was a CW operator as I am today, and that was an SSB transceiver, and I guess you live and learn, don't you? But eventually, I got some birds of my own. And again, I will expound upon them in a future video. Stan Gibilisco signing off, saying 73, which means best regards and so long, which, chirp or not, SSB transceiver or not, as long as the thing had sent the code, which it always did in my case, did-da-da-da-da is always what I closed my QSOs with.